Hi. I just want to ask you about the spike we're seeing in cases and some of what seems like a lack of preparation in big provinces like Ontario. We're seeing where they're having to dial back now on some of the loosening that they had allowed. So are we repeating some of the same mistakes of this spring? What's going on? How is it possible that places like Toronto and Ottawa don't have the testing in place to cope with the demand?
It's a really good question. It's probably best directed to the province of Ontario. As you know, through the Safe Restart Agreement, we designated billions of dollars to provinces and territories so that they could be ready for fall to deal with an anticipated surge if, in fact, we saw a rising number of infections. I work on a regular basis with Ontario and my Quebec counterparts to make sure that they have the supports they need from both a procurement perspective but also from a fiscal perspective. And we are constantly encouraging both provinces to make sure that they're looking at their processes and enhancing their testing capacity as soon as possible.
Well, what's your response to the fact that that's not there?
It's very alarming.
I appreciate you saying you gave money to the provinces, but honestly, you're the health minister. So what?
Well, I'm a federal health minister. Absolutely.
But what's going on? That's a lot of Canadians are looking at this and saying it's a huge fail.
Well, I think it's a little premature to say it's a huge fail. I think there's an opportunity right now with both provinces, with their medical officers of health, to look at their testing strategies and to make sure that the strategies are appropriate. For example, in British Columbia, which is also seeing a surge, they're not necessarily having the same surge on testing sites, and partly that's because they have a different strategy. So I think the ministers of health in both provinces need to be very thoughtful at this point in time to determine if the strategy that they've chosen is working. I know Ontario is planning on opening up additional testing centres in the days and weeks to come, and we continue to be there to support actually local public health units with other supports that they might need. As you know, and I spoke about this yesterday, I've directly reached out to the medical officer of Peel. I'll be having a conversation with Dr. Etches from Ottawa very shortly. I've spoken just last week with Dr. Davila and Mayor Tory. These are conversations we'll continue to have because we can, at the federal level, obviously support local public health with the tools that they need. But in terms of testing strategy, I think this is an opportune time for both ministers of health, along with their advisors, to take a look at their strategy and determine what more they can do to accelerate access to testing. It's very important as well that people call ahead to testing facilities, that they understand what the criteria are for acquiring testing in their various jurisdictions.
Hi, Minister Hajdu. What about rapid testing? What's the holdup? It seems that other jurisdictions, such as the United States, have approved, rapid testing devices. What's the holdup in Canada?
Well, I appreciate you using the United States as a comparator. I mean, I think what we want to make sure is that when we approve rapid testing, that we have a degree of confidence in their accuracy. So the last thing I would want to see as a federal health minister is a test that only had, let's say, 50% accuracy, and people are accessing a rapid test and then assuming they're COVID negative, but in fact they're positive, and having that false sense of assurance. My team is working, as you know, at Health Canada with the regulators to accelerate regulatory review of any test that comes forward, but I, of course, want to make sure that we do that in a very thorough and rigorous way. I think there is an actual risk to approving tests before we can determine how they'll be used and what populations and what safeguards will be in place to make sure that they're truly delivering what we need, which is to determine if someone has COVID-19 or not.
But is the holdup that y'all don't have, Health Canada is not confident enough in these rapid testing devices? Is it the providers of these test devices? What is the holdup?
The holdup is the technology has not accelerated to the point where we have received a test for approval that has an accuracy to the degree that we believe it is prudent to allow it into the Canadian market. Now, having said that, I will just also say that I'm putting together now a testing expert advisory panel that will help us look at combinations of testing strategies. But I will say this, we will not at Health Canada approve a test that in any way endangers Canadians' health. And I will say that tests that don't have a degree of accuracy to the satisfaction of the regulators can actually create further harms in communities. Can you imagine a scenario where people could purchase a rapid test in a pharmacy, let's say, and it's only 50% accurate? We're just not there yet. We have not had a test submitted to Health Canada for approval yet that satisfies the regulators' concerns around accuracy.
We have Mr. O'Toole just saying today he's being tested after one of his staff and his family are being tested after one of his staff tested positive. We have Mr. Blanchette, his wife is now tested positive. We have a guard on Parliament Hill, a security guard in the Senate. We have a throne speech next week. How worried are you about all of this getting into Parliament, the House of Commons in Parliament, and what steps are being taken to prevent that from happening?
I think it's an excellent point, and I would encourage all leaders of opposition parties to really consider the ability to vote virtually, because I think this is a problem that's going to be with us for a while, and we certainly have a number of options on the table for opposition parties in terms of continuing Parliament through a hybrid model that includes voting. I think it's a very real concern because, of course, the nature of our work means that we come into contact with people that may be in contact with other people. We travel frequently for work. It is, as we move from one zone to another. I live in a zone, for example, that has no active cases right now in Thunder Bay, Ontario, but I will be returning there, and so it, presents risk to our communities as well when we travel. So we have to manage that all very carefully. But I'll also say that we are in a stage of living with COVID, and the reality is that will sometimes mean that we will have to isolate if we're close contacts. That each of us has to assess our own personal risk in terms of our activities, and that we have an ultimate responsibility to protect the health of people around us.
Hi, Minister. Respectfully, I think my colleague's question was about the throne speech specifically. So is it really necessary for people to actually go in the Senate for the Governor General to say it there? Why not do it virtually or another thing? What's your take on that?
I don't know what the arrangements are for throne speech, so I can't comment on the specifics. But what I can say is that our party has been very clear and our government has been very clear that we should not be putting each other's health at risk. And there are ways to do that, including physical distancing, wearing face masks when it's when we're unable to keep a distance of 2 meters or more, making sure that we have thorough hygiene in the places that we're working. And businesses are struggling with this, by the way, all around the world and including in Canada. And that balance is very important, but the rigor is very important as well. I will remind us that face masks are not an excuse to get closer together, and I have seen that phenomenon in the last several days since I've re-emerged in Canadian society from Northern Ontario, where people are wearing a face mask and speaking very closely to me, and it makes me very uncomfortable. So we have to remind each other that the face mask is actually not a substitute for the 2 meters, that really is a much higher degree of protection.
Two quick questions. Well, what's your take, first of all, on regional lockdowns? We've seen in Quebec there's now some codes with colors. Do you think that's the way to go for a potential second wave?
I do think that a more surgical approach is the way to manage potential outbreaks of COVID-19. I think a worst-case scenario is to have a quite an oppressive lockdown countrywide, especially when we know that COVID-19 is not in particular regions of our country, and those economies can function very well with the vigilance of ensuring that they're getting on any case right away and doing that contact tracing. In terms of regional alert systems and regional economic decisions, obviously local public health has to drive those decisions, but there are drivers that we know accelerate risk. For example, bars in crowded conditions where people are talking closely and there's alcohol involved, large congregate settings where people are hosting weddings. Again, oftentimes when there's a co-occurrence of alcohol, it tends to make us let down our guard. It's nice to feel normal, and so people start to forget about the 2 meters distance between themselves and the need to take those precautions seriously. So I think each region really needs to assess what's working and what's not working based on their own epidemiology, and I completely think that premiers are on the right track when they're talking about regional or local measures that can help bring down an outbreak.
I just have one other question. You've already appointed a review of the
GFIN.
The Early Alert Network. And back in April, the government, yourself and the Prime Minister were saying there's going to be a time for lessons learned. Why haven't we now, 9 months into when this was declared a global health emergency, haven't we actually appointed an independent review? Because as time goes on, people forget the insights and things that happened earlier. So I'm just wondering, when is the right time to appoint that independent review you talked about back in April?
Of the GFIN?
No, of the whole response. As SARS 2003 was going on, the Liberal government of the day appointed the review mid-crisis so that things in real time were being examined, and it became a very vital report, as you know. So why haven't you appointed that kind of review now 9 months into this crisis?
So thank you for that question. So we have at Health Canada been collecting all of the lessons learned, and in fact, that's what's feeding into the next decisions as we go into the next period of living with COVID, and we continue to do that. And we're just at the beginning of this pandemic. This is, it concerns me when I hear people say during the pandemic, because in fact what we know is that until we have a blend of therapeutics and vaccines, we'll be living with COVID-19 for quite some time. And I think that it's very important to remember that we appointed people in Health Canada to document every step of the way from the very beginning.
But should that not be, sorry, I can hardly, should that not be subject to independent review? I think the whole point about the SARS and the H1N1 pieces were they were independently done. They had outside observers coming in and help the government understand what the government did wrong. I don't know how reassuring it is to know that Health Canada is reviewing itself. So can you tell me why there hasn't been that kind of independent review or lessons learned exercise started right now?
Well, thanks, Tanya. I'll certainly consider your suggestion, but what I'll just say is that there will be plenty of opportunity. There'll be plenty of opportunities. We're smiling at each other here. There will be plenty of opportunities to think about additional reviews that we can undertake as a Government of Canada, and I'm not opposed at all to have that review. I think it's going to be very important for all countries around the world to look at what worked and what didn't work and what we learned through this process. Certainly the things that we did learn through SARS helped us, but obviously not enough, and we have much to learn through our response to COVID-19 as well.
When we're at the beginning, can you clarify that a little more, explain exactly what you mean in terms of a timeline? You must have estimates from your own department how long this is going to extend to. Are we talking next spring, next fall?
Thank you. Actually, my estimates in terms of a timeline are not necessarily in months or years, but really around the kinds of tools that we'll develop as a world and certainly as a country to help us manage this in a more efficient way. So the combination of therapeutics and vaccines and, of course, technology like rapid tests will be definitely helpful in terms of managing the pandemic. But as we all know, science takes time, and we have to continue to invest in science, work and trust in the science that's developing. But those are the suite of tools that I believe will be necessary.
Minister,
Thank you.
Can I just get one question really briefly?
Yeah, I was just asking, how do you feel about going back to PEI and having to isolate for 14 days?
Well, the measures that have been taken have worked very well. So you can't argue against that. Health is the most important thing. I support the province on every measure it's taken. I did. It's up to the province to do what they wish, but all I can tell you is that it worked very well in Prince Edward Island.
Can you clarify if you isolate for 14 days when you go back, if you're a politician who's an essential worker? I thought some cabinet ministers were on the East Coast and they didn't isolate. Can you clarify if you will isolate for 14 days when you go back?
What I have to do is be tested when I go back, and I certainly will be.
But you don't have to isolate.
And the last time I went back, I isolated for after the second test. I don't know how many days, but it was over a week anyhow.
Okay.
Backlog in terms of disability benefits applications?
Well, we're working very well on it, and it's one of the most important issues in my portfolio. And we intend to address it, and I'm so pleased that we got about $200 million to deal with it. Well, of course, the money is not through yet. But of course, we're putting the process in place and making the appropriate changes. Many other changes need to be made in order to speed up the process. Like if you're jumping out of an airplane, you're apt to have bad knees. If you're going to have bad hearing, these things are being done much quicker.
No plans to auto-approve any of those at this point?
No, but what you have to be careful of is to make sure that the veteran receives the appropriate compensation as best you can. I don't think you can appropriately compensate anybody for what happens, but to make sure that as best you can do to make sure that the veteran is appropriately compensated for the injury that he or she has.
Last question before I let you go. Where are we in terms of timeline or wait times? Have they been going up because of COVID? And have we seen a large increase over the last 3 months?
No, I believe it's decreased slightly. The department has worked very well during the epidemic, and they've worked from home, but we've got excellent work from our public servants. Department of Veterans Affairs is working very well in the situation that's in. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Blair. What can you tell us about the Canadian border and the tweaks you're trying to make it easier to work in the next few months?
Well, first of all decisions with relation to the border are taken after very careful consideration of a number of very important factors. The first and most important priority, of course, is the safety and health of Canadians, and so we have, a decision to make as we approach the end of the current period of non-essential travel, which terminates on September 21st, and so we're working towards that. And at the same time, we've been listening to, I've had conversations with border mayors, for example, with our provincial and territorial partners, and with Canadians, and there are, we know, some significant impacts on the restrictions that we have put in place. We are looking at how we can establish a process to facilitate some of those important potential exemptions, but do it in a way that does not compromise the security and safety and the health of Canadians. And so we are working hard to develop those processes to make sure that those determinations can be made.
So what kind of exemptions are we talking about?
Well, there are issues with respect to family reunification issues of extended family members, issues with respect to international students, and there have been a number of, I think, very significant cases of compassion where people have made very compelling cases, and we want to make sure that there is, a very careful process in place where people can apply for those exemptions, that they can be properly evaluated, not in a few minutes of conversation at the border, but prior to that, so that we can show compassion at the same time maintain the integrity of the border.
Business exemptions as well?
I'm sorry?
Business exemption for...
Again, there are some discussions with the business community. We're not going to compromise the safety of Canadians, but we are looking at ways in which that can be appropriately managed.
Mr. Blair, I'd like to get your reaction to a story from the Globe this morning that Huawei is tracking the names of supportive Canadians and passing that information on to the Chinese government. I'm wondering, as a Canadian, how you feel about that information being collected and also being passed on to the Chinese government.
Let me be very clear. We will always act in the interest of Canadians. We will take the steps necessary to protect the integrity of our information and technology systems, and we are aware of the risks to that system and are now taking the steps necessary to act accordingly. With respect to individuals gathering information, we are often lobbied by the business sector, but our first priority will always be the protection of Canadian interests.
What does that mean, though? What do you mean when you say you're worried about protecting Canadian interests? I'm asking you specifically about Huawei as a company collecting information and passing it to the Chinese government.
Well, I generally speak of not a particular company, but actors generally around the world. We want to make sure that we have all those things in place to ensure the safety and security of our information infrastructure, of Canadian data, Canadian business interests.
Given they're doing this, though, can you trust that how can they be trusted as a company to work in such a sensitive area and even be considered in such a sensitive area if they are doing this?
We always assess a wide range of threats and risks to the country, and we take into account the activities of various actors, both state and private corporations, to ensure that we do what's right for Canadians.
So you're not concerned by it?
Well, I don't want to give the impression we don't have a concern. We monitor these situations very, very carefully, assess all of that information and intelligence in its totality in making our determinations about what's right for Canadian security.
Hi, Minister. Could you just confirm, and just to be very clear, is the U.S. border going to stay closed until at least October 21st?
That's a decision that's being made based on an assessment of a number of very significant factors. We look at the health environment on both sides of the border, our ability to manage the safety and security. I think, overwhelmingly, I've talked to the mayors in border towns. I've talked to the provinces and territories. They've made it very clear that they're still very concerned about the movement of non-essential trade and traffic of people across that border, and so we are always going to be cautious. The actual determination of rolling that over will be announced in a few days.
Is it being made or been made? Sorry, with the mask we can't hear very well.
I'm sorry. The decision is being made. It will be announced very shortly, certainly in a timely way before the September 21st, when it would have to take effect.
Thanks, guys.
Changes this fall to the RCMP to deal with systemic racism?
You know, I want to assure Canadians there's a great deal of work going on looking at all aspects of our society, and particularly in the criminal justice system, of the impacts of systemic racism. The RCMP play a very important part in that work, and so yes, they're involved in it, but we're not limiting our examination just to the activities of the police, but every aspect structurally and systemically within the criminal justice system that results in disparate outcomes for racialized and Indigenous people in this country.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Mr. Garneau? Mr. Garneau?
Minister Garneau, sorry for the wait. Are you considering getting rid of the quarantine period for travelers, from places like Europe?
So what we're doing is making sure that there's the proper balance between ensuring the health safety of Canadians during this COVID period and also taking a risk management approach that examines whether it is possible to shorten quarantine. But that can only be done if you have a reliable test in place and an efficient way of administering it. So we take our guidance from PHAC, and they tell us, and they ultimately will make the decisions about whether there is a way of shortening quarantine.
Okay, so it's definitely something that you're considering. We understand that Transport Canada took part in the Boeing 737 MAX 8 tests. What did you learn from those tests?
So those results are being analyzed at the moment, but you're quite right. Canada made the decision that we would do our own flight testing on the Boeing that has been modified with the supposed solution that involves software and hardware changes. And this week, we are participating with other regulators, the United States, the Europeans, and the Brazilians and Canada, over in Gatwick, England, to look at the training requirements that we might need to put in place for the future, as well as the procedures that are used by pilots in case something goes wrong. So that's a very important part of it. It's not just a fix to the hardware, it's also procedures and training that are being looked at very carefully. And we will not allow the MAX 8 to fly into or out of Canada until we're 100% certain that the problem has been addressed. That's one of the lessons that we have learned. We're taking a very strict approach towards validation and certification.
Minister, a U.S. Congress report slams both Boeing and the FAA for its handling. Does that change Canada's position of working with the FAA?
No, it doesn't change our approach to working with the FAA, but as I said, after the very tragic ET-302 Ethiopian crash, I stated that it was something, it was important for us in Canada to re-examine. We certify aircraft in this country and lots of aviation products, and we also validate products that come from other countries, like the Boeing MAX 8. And the validation process and the certification process, I said after this tragic accident that we would re-examine it, and that is what we are doing. And of course, we're very, very actively looking at the fix for the MAX 8.
Minister, given this has gone on so long, have you given any thought to reconsidering whether or not airlines should return and refund people who had bought tickets back in January, February, and weren't able to travel, and now are 9 months into this, still haven't been able to get refunds?
As I've said before, I have a lot of sympathy for people who did not get refunds, who would have preferred a refund instead of a credit. And at the same time, I've also stated that our airlines are going through a very difficult period. So it's not an easy one to resolve. And the CTA, the Canadian Transportation Agency, has spoken about this issue. And ultimately, if somebody is unhappy with the fact that they didn't get a refund, they can go to the Canadian Transportation Agency and put their case forward.
It's nice that you have sympathy for them, but shouldn't they just get their money back? Isn't that fair? Without having to go through the CTA? I mean, that's something that most people are not going to take on themselves. Shouldn't they just do this? Isn't it the right thing to do?
Well, a lot of people are actually going to the CTA, and the CTA has stated that it is not clear in many instances whether the airlines have an obligation to refund. The issuing of a credit, which many of them have now extended for longer periods of time, is also an option that can be looked at. And as I said about the airlines themselves, they are in some cases in a difficult stage to the point where they are possibly going to lose all the liquidity that they had, and that it's very difficult for them at the moment when 90% of their revenue is gone to address this issue.
Bonjour, M. Garneau, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Avec le Canada qui semble être sur le point ou au début d'une deuxième vague, le nombre de cas qui augmente, quand vient le temps de parler d'ouvrir les frontières avec notamment certains pays européens, puisque nous, on commence à avoir de l'avantage de cas, est-ce que vous n'avez pas peur qu'on se fasse refuser cette entente-là avec ces pays-là, puisqu'ils ne voudront pas nous avoir chez eux?
Bien, nous, on prend toujours l'approche que c'est la sécurité des Canadiens qui est primordiale, et c'est en fait l'Agence de la santé publique qui prend les décisions concernant des options qu'on pourrait considérer. Et puis, je peux assurer les Canadiens et les Canadiennes qu'on ne prendra pas de risque si la situation change au Canada ou dans d'autres pays qui étaient peut-être considérés comme sécuritaires, mais où la situation a évolué. Alors, on regarde ça tous les jours avant de prendre des décisions, et vraiment, la sécurité des Canadiens est primordiale.
Est-ce qu'il y a des exemptions qui devraient être ajoutées à la frontière américaine pour faciliter un certain flot, contrairement à ce qu'on a présentement? Est-ce qu'il y a des choses que vous regardez qui pourraient faciliter la vie tout en gardant la frontière fermée?
Je pense qu'on s'est adapté depuis le début. On a d'abord reconnu qu'il y a des gens qui doivent traverser la frontière, entre autres les camionneurs, parce que le commerce est important et la disponibilité de médicaments et de choses essentielles est importante, et il y en a qui viennent des États-Unis. Alors, on réexamine la situation continuellement pour identifier quelle population, quelle profession devrait être exemptée et pouvoir traverser la frontière, mais en considérant très strictement le risque vis-à-vis de la santé.
Donc, une annonce bientôt?
Non, il n'y a pas d'annonce en ce moment. Que vous savez, en ce moment, la frontière est fermée, sauf aux travailleurs essentiels, et puis on réexamine continuellement. Merci beaucoup.
Bonjour. Are there any questions? I'm happy not to take questions. So.
Quand on parle de relance verte, est-ce que les Canadiens sont là présentement? Les Canadiens, est-ce qu'ils ont le goût d'entendre parler de ça maintenant, vous croyez?
Oui, bien sûr, les Canadiens maintenant, ils pensent très, très fort sur la pandémie, le COVID-19, et ils veulent que le gouvernement donne le support qu'ils ont besoin. Mais bien sûr, je crois que comme on pense de l'avenir, la crise de changement climatique, c'est très important pour tous les Canadiens. Et bien sûr, ils veulent que si nous faisons les investissements, que les investissements sont verts, et il doit adresser la crise de changement climatique et le déclin de biodiversité dans le monde.
Mais est-ce qu'on est là maintenant ou c'est quelque chose qu'on doit faire éventuellement quand la crise sera passée?
C'est quelque chose qui est très important quand nous pensons sur qu'est-ce que nous pouvons faire dans le court terme, bien sûr, mais c'est dans le contexte d'assurer les Canadiens que nous avons les supports, les mesures pour avoir le support pour les familles et les entreprises qui ont beaucoup de problèmes parce que la pandémie.
Your government has signaled that the green economy was going to be a big part of the throne speech and its agenda moving forward over the next few months. To what extent have the events of the last week, the rising number of cases across the country, changed that focus? And based on what you've heard from your cabinet colleagues, how much appetite is there still for that, given the pandemic we're facing now?
Well, I think everybody's concerned about the rise in cases, you know, and none of us want to go back to the situation we were in a few months ago. So first and foremost, we have to be sure that we're doing the things with our provincial and territorial counterparts to try to stem the rise and to ensure that Canadians will be safe. That being said, you know, what the throne speech is intended to do is to outline sort of the broad parameters and the themes that will be important for the government over the course of the coming session of Parliament. And certainly in that context, the work to address the climate crisis is very important and will remain very important for this government. As I say, I mean, you know, we are in the midst of a current crisis and we have to be cognizant of that, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that the crisis of climate change is on the horizon, and if we do not address it in the near term, the consequences will be dire.
Hi, Minister. I've heard what you've just said, and other ministers have said this week about that, and so it's still a priority for you. I've also heard you guys talk still about net zero by 2050, but I haven't heard anyone say you're going to meet your Paris targets for 2030. Since the campaign last year, are you still committed to meeting those targets?
Well, we're actually not committed to meeting the target. We're committed to exceeding the target.
Yeah, so are you still
and we are absolutely committed to exceeding the target. I can tell you I'm working very hard on the elements of a plan that will allow us to provide Canadians visibility about how we're going to do that. But absolutely, we are committed to exceeding our target.
And I was going to ask you exactly about that plan and your energy framework. When exactly will Canadians see the details of that plan?
Well, as I say, I mean, we're in the context of a pandemic, so obviously it depends a little bit in terms of how things evolve, because I think Canadians first and foremost want us to be focused on that. But certainly the intention is to bring forward an enhanced climate plan in the relatively near term, and certainly well before COP26.
Minister, so I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I have heard that from a lot of other ministers, but has your file, the climate file, been put on the back burner during this meeting here in terms of the talks?
Absolutely not. I mean, I would tell you that it is beyond the crisis that we are seized with right now, which obviously is top of mind for everybody. I would tell you that it is one of the highest priorities for my colleagues around the cabinet table, for my colleagues in the Liberal caucus. People are very much aware that you know, this is an existential threat. It's also an enormous economic opportunity. As somebody comes from the clean tech sector, I think there's an enormous economic opportunity here. And I would tell you that we want to seize the opportunity and we want to address that threat in lockstep with partners like Germany, like France, and like the United Kingdom.
Except Germany and France and the United Kingdom have actually announced stuff that they're going to do in terms of the green recovery and have been rather specific about that, and your government has not. So how do you convince Canadians that what you're saying is true, that you're still committed to that, the climate crisis is still important, the crisis that, in fact, your government was largely elected on?
Well, I would tell you, you know, stay tuned, because we do intend to bring forward an enhanced climate plan that will have elements that in some respects will not be dissimilar to some of the things that are being done in Europe, although it certainly is in a different, you know, a Canadian context. But I talk to my counterparts in Germany and in the United Kingdom and in a range of other countries in Europe very frequently. We are learning from some of the things that they're doing. I think they're learning from some of the things that we're thinking about doing. And I will tell you that our level of ambition is high, and that is certainly in part because we actually see that this is something that we must do, but it's also in part because those who actually are first movers will actually reap the economic benefits and the jobs. So.
But in terms of convincing Canadians that is the case, right? If it's not a you know, pillar of the throne speech, and how do Canadians believe that this government is still going to move forward with their election promises?
I think, I mean, first of all, I think we should wait for the throne speech. I think we should also be clear on what the throne speech is and what the throne speech isn't. The throne speech typically outlines broad priorities that the government has, articulates those, which are important and certainly are a signal to the public service in terms of where to spend time and energy. But it's not a budget. It's not a funding mechanism. And I think we should all stay tuned and listen to the throne speech. I have every confidence that there will be some significant discussion of green and climate change. So.
Can you tell us when we'll see details? Can you tell us when we'll see details of the clean fuel standard?
Pardon me?
Can you tell us when we'll see details of the clean fuel standard? The government just says fall 2020.
Well, I mean, we've been consulting on the clean fuel standard now since 2017, so it's not like the broad parameters are not known and not out there. In fact, I provided an update with respect to a number of the things, including the targets and the stringency, just a couple of months ago. So the elements of the clean fuel standard are already out there for public discussion, and there's been lots of consultation. In terms of finalizing it, we're moving forward to do that, and that will happen, over the next number of months.
Are you concerned about the impact on natural resource industries?
The clean fuel standard, again, is an economic opportunity. It will drive the development of the biofuels industry in Canada, the renewable natural gas industry in Canada, the hydrogen industry in Canada. It's an opportunity for us to actually seize the opportunities that are enabled by moving to a low-carbon future. And moving through the work on the clean fuel standard to having lower carbon content fuels is a critical part of our climate strategy. I mean, this is not new. I mean, the fact that people somehow think that the clean fuel standard is a brand new sort of idea. We've had renewable blending standards in Canada for a long time. The clean fuel standard is a next step in that evolution, but we've been doing it, and so have countries and states around the world. I mean, California's got one. BC has one, a clean fuel standard. So this is not new news. We are working hard with industry to ensure some of their concerns are addressed, and I certainly did that in the context of changing the ramp with respect to when investments will likely need to be made. I'm certainly open, and I've been very clear with industry about this, that if there are things that we can do to help with respect to some of the investments that will be required, we're open to that conversation. But the clean fuel standard is a critical part of the climate plan, and we are moving ahead.
Thank you. Question on things that are happening in Europe and your response to that. Can you give us some examples of what you're looking at in Europe that you think could translate to Canada?
Well, I think everybody in many of the countries in Europe, and certainly we, are looking very, very closely at hydrogen as an energy carrier. That is, I think, going to be a critical piece going forward of a number of ways to actually reduce emissions. It's also in Canada, I think, a very interesting, it opens up some interesting opportunities for us to think about extracting energy value from existing resources without carbon. And so that's certainly a place. I mean, some of the others are pretty obvious, right? I mean, it's about how do you deploy more zero-emission vehicles more quickly. It's about how do you retrofit existing buildings, and both commercial and residential. And so there's a whole range of things, and some of the tools that they're using, we're certainly looking at. Some of the tools we've already talked about in our platform around retrofits and those kinds of things.
On hydrogen, which type of hydrogen are you looking at? Are you going to prioritize one over the other?
No, I mean, I think there are some really interesting opportunities for both blue and green hydrogen. Green is abundant in the sense that we have lots of hydroelectricity in this country, and the challenge for green is just sometimes the cost structure, and so we need to do some work on that. Blue is a real opportunity for the existing, particularly gas, but in some cases potentially oil, to think about extracting energy value from existing hydrocarbon resources without carbon pollution. And so I think we need to look at both. There are some really interesting pieces of work going on in technology on the blue side, and I think that's something that can be really important for a country like Canada.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.